Thank you, and welcome back to our roundtable on sexual identity, health in India. I'm going to, there have been a number of comments and questions posted on Facebook and tweeted to us, so I'll go over a few of them that we're hoping to address in this next session, as well as a couple of themes from those comments that we'd like to also focus on. Let me first start with the themes. One of the topics that hasn't been discussed much yet is that on hijra and transgender, so we're going to try and do that a little bit in this next session. We're also going to talk more about Penal Code 377 and the decriminalization of homosexuality in India, both its origins and contemporary debates. We'll talk a little bit about regional city variation. India is it's quite diverse gay identities, and so we'll talk about that a bit. There was a lot of comments on the biomedical piece and interventions and how that will play out in India. We'll maybe finish up with that. Now to some specific questions. One of them was that, and comments, was that is the politics of consumerism in India and the portrayal of homosexuality in a consumerist way an empowering one? There was a comment about the portrayal of homosexuality in Dostana, and one of the audience members thought that they didn't feel it was very positive because the lead characters were heterosexual males pretending to be homosexual. And perhaps we can talk a little more about Philip's friend who thought it was great, and is this an incrementalism? What does that mean? Do we take small steps and celebrate them? One of the other comments was the role of internet and our activists using the internet as a venue to reach gay men and MSM in India. And I think this also goes into the idea of the hierarchy that's been created between kind of a gay, internet-savvy, cosmopolitan Indian MSM versus some of the MSM, as Philip was mentioning, that are in the drop-in centers, more middle, lower class, in sex venues. And so I think we can focus on some of those issues as well. So with that, I think we will start with, group, hold me to the task of, going over these points, but we'll start with the Penal Code 377.
Okay, what I'll do is just give a little bit of historical perspective to where we are now, and then Sanjay will sort of walk us through the current tussles over the repeal. I mean, as everyone knows, Section 377 refers to a statute in the Indian Penal Code which is criminalizes unnatural behavior that refers to sexual conduct. The Indian Penal Code was conceived in 1861 by the Law Commission, headed by Lord Macaulay, one of the major figures. But what's interesting and often forgotten about Section 377 is that it was conceived under a larger category, which was called offenses against the body, which included other crimes such as rape, forceful kidnapping, etc. Now, the only reason I'm mentioning this is because it's important to understand where it emerged out of, because that's where some of the current debates are circling around. That's the first thing. And the second thing, too, also, which I think is actually very interesting for us in our contemporary rights activism, etc., is that the Indian Penal Code's offenses against the body section was the most heavily contested and debated within the English sort of reform commissions who were trying to figure out these laws, because the problem was that colonial difference, i.e. the difference between them versus us, the colonizers and the colonized, was organized around the idea that all natives are sexually perverse, right? So the idea is, how do you legislate something that's everywhere? So the idea of having a section that would penalize same-sex, they wouldn't use the word same-sex, they'd use unnatural conduct, became interesting for the judicial courts because they had to legislate against something that they were also arguing was everywhere. So the way they decided to argue it was in the first few cases, and I spent a good bit of time thinking about this and working on this, the first 25 to 30 cases that are filed against Section 377, the 1870s, are around bestiality, which is men usually having sex with other men, with animals. The men with men comes much later, and the other figuration, which is more familiar to us, is the men that are arrested are wearing women's clothes. That's the second piece. And the third piece is that it appears in a lot of medical jurisprudence journals, and they are usually cases of situational homosexuality, i.e. in prisons, which is something that I have not heard anything about here, right? Which, of course, is very familiar to those of us who work in the U.S. as the discourse of homosexuality in the prisons, but it was part of the early legislation around. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning these things is because of the difficulty of legislating something that's everywhere but cannot be organized. And the second is the question around rape and protection of minors, because the kidnapping of young girls was also attached to this offenses against the body. So some of the reasons why feminists in the earlier versions of this debate were anxious about the repeal was falsely read as them being homophobic, etc., but was more around what other legislation could they find which would provide protection for minors, etc. So I think that question continues to circulate in some ways and has not taken up as much room in the current debates, but is a residue of the earlier question. And of course, fast forward to the current moment. But it's also one more thing is that the Section 377, the Penal Code, was in circulation all across British colonies. So not just in India, of course, but in former British colonies in Africa and, of course, in Trinidad, in the Caribbean, and here. So I think it's also worthwhile to think about what's going on in those places in relationship to this question. And the current repeal, of course, is organized around revisiting this history and speaking about why it's important to get rid of a law that was conceived within the model of a colonial, immoral state, right? So I think that piece is very important here. So the activists are not just saying, well, we need to get rid of 377 because we have gay people in India and it's natural to be gay within Indian culture, et cetera, however you parse the idea of gay. But it's also because they're saying this is a law that was conceived within a model of colonial disenfranchisement, so why should we embrace something when we've gotten rid of all the other laws that were problematic, right? Like the laws around the Uniform Civil Code, et cetera. The debates around that have also been about writing against the colonial state. So perhaps Sanjay can fill us in now on the more recent events in Delhi.
Yeah, and I think that's important context. In terms of, for example, the criminal tribes law has been done away with,
right, yeah.
And when this 377 was being developed, the criminal tribes law was also being discussed, certain categories of people who were designated as naturally criminal.
Like thuggees would be one of the crucial,
right,
yeah.
I think very briefly, as everyone knows, the immediate provocation for this was an NGO saying that if we have this law, it hampers our public work in terms of preventing or anti-AIDS, HIV work, right? That was the most immediate provocation, and we get rid of this. So the immediate provocation wasn't itself about broader issues of identity and stuff, and that got built into the larger argument quite rightly. The other thing is, of course, it's been read down rather than been gotten rid of. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is that there were many groups, such as people who work with children, who said that children may be sodomized, for example, and that so we need to retain aspects of 377 because young boys, for example, as they put it, may be sodomized by men. So many groups working with children, but in particular, said that it cannot be gotten rid of because there are certain aspects to it that we need to consider. So it's been read down, right, rather than decriminalized. The third thing is that decriminalization is not the same as deregulation, right? Because in everyday life, it is still regulated through informal means. So it's been decriminalized, but there's still a huge amount of deregulation.
Such as?
Well, in everyday, for example, gay people in public spaces are still regulated either by the police. Yeah. So even though it's been decriminalized, in everyday quotidian interactions, that still continues to happen. The other thing is that it's something that the Delhi High Court has said. So it's not a pan-India thing. So although it existed, 377 existed across India, And Delhi High Court is not the apex court, it's the Supreme Court. So it's applicable to Delhi, so I don't know what happens in future, whether it gets passed on to other states. And finally, as we've discussed earlier, that because the judges, in fact, the judges broadened the category. The activists who filed the case, the petition, the judges actually reflected on it, and I think they were actually quite good, and they broadened the category. They had lots of discussion about private and public. But nevertheless, because they often borrowed from case studies, I can't remember this case studies in the US, where the judge said, but the intimacy between men is as natural as intimacy between men and women, because after all, no one is forcing them, so there's no money involved, for example. Okay, so the Indian judges borrowed some of these arguments and said, well, homosexuality is natural after all, because these two people are doing it voluntarily, and because of that line of reasoning that homosexual intimacy is natural as heterosexual intimacy because no one's forcing anyone, the idea of money got into it, because automatically there was an argument about what is unnatural kind of sex. And one is, well, if someone pays you, well, that's bad, right? But no one's paying anyone here, so homosexual intimacy is as natural. So then, of course, as people have argued, that brings in the problem that it sets up a hierarchy of good sexuality and bad sexuality. So middle-class homosexual behavior becomes the equivalent of middle-class heterosexual behavior in India. And of course the privacy argument that although the judges did say that in fact you can be a private person even in a public space, which is an argument which wasn't there in the earlier petition. And actually judges were almost, I think they were fabulous in many ways given the constraints of legality and law. And there was a long discussion about the fact that even in a public space, how you might, these activities could well be seen as private. So the distinction between private and public is incorrect, they said. But that was the basis of the judgment. That was the basis of the discussion. And of course the notion of who does it leave out? Of course, the notion of the larger problem of actually visualizing lesbianism as an activity itself within Indian sexual discourse is something that's also gotten.
There is actually one case in 1975 which was filed and dropped by the father of a woman who accused the woman she was having sex with under Section 377, and the reason was because he found a phallic object, like a dildo, in the bedroom of his daughter.
Yeah.
And the court actually reviewed the case and then dropped it because the presence of a phallic object constituted some form that could be recognized by the state. The other caveat, which I'll add and then I'll end, is what's interesting about what Sanjay is saying, which is very important, is that within the United States, in Lawrence v. Texas, which was the big case that everyone talks about, which supposedly restored privacy rights to gay people, was very much organized not around adjugating about the moral question of homosexuality, whether it's natural or unnatural. In fact, a lot of the judges demurred on the natural. They were more interested on the individual right to privacy. So there are two different things here that within the Naz Foundation initiated repeal, which was then taken on by many other organizations. The individual language of individuality drops away. So there's more a language of collectivity within, which I think is also worth thinking about within the Indian context versus the US context. The US context is very much driven by the language of individual rights, whereas the 377 debates in India have hinged away, I think, from that a little bit. So
I was thinking that it might be really useful, just continuing on from that, to hear a little bit from Stuart on
Sure.
sort of comparative contextualization, because here we have these issues around the natural, the unnatural, the public, the private, and also the question of the relationship between, say, something like considering something unnatural and considering it obscene, and so forth, as legal categories. I'm not expecting you to respond to all of this.
No.
But it seems like there would be some interesting comparative issues to be put on the table.
Well, and I think that there was already a beginning, and that was, I'm assuming that you were saying, and I think the correction that Anjali was making is correct, that the discussion of the U.S. case, it's got to be Lawrence v. Texas, wasn't to say that it was natural. The one thing I would add that really strikes me when you look at the evolution in the U.S. from Bowers v. Hardwick that actually left the criminalization of sodomy, homosexual sodomy, in place when it had been criminalized independent of sex, to Lawrence v. Texas, which got rid of homosexual sodomy across the board, was also the emphasis on the family context and privacy of the home. So, which is something that you were raising before, and I think is a huge subject in terms of understanding homosexuality and sexuality. The extent to which our discussions about that are organized by these notions of marriage, family, and so on. But it is interesting, and I think that in the U.S., which I think is part of what William was raising, is the echoes are kind of amazing. I mean, the discussion that this is a law from the 1860s, and then your description of how this is discussed has tremendous parallels
quite.
in terms of, homosexuality as a medical forensic
Quite.
legal category. It's very similar. And obviously not unrelated. But the question also around the question of naturalness also refers back to a kind of the transformation of religious categories to medical and biological categories. There's this, moving from sin to crime to health or a medical diagnosis or a mental disorder. And I think the way this took place in the U.S. very much was somehow when Bowers v. Texas was debated, it was all about sodomy as an act and a focus and a phobia about that act as being unnatural, unchristian, and so on, and not part of our culture, to over a period of time, I think, as part of the larger political struggle around gay rights and the recognition of gays as a political, as opposed to really a sexual group, you then could have a discussion that focused on they're the same, but similarly in terms of an emphasis on a very normative version. So I'm not sure exactly how the exclusions work. I mean, it's very interesting to hear you talk about who really is clearly covered by this and who isn't really being covered and protected by it. And we have the same problems in the U.S., and this is a huge debate within the movement, is, as we emphasize here, the emphasis on gay marriage as being the issue and the solution to all our problems does a similar kind of thing of, we're saving this group, and is this the group of basically white middle class and who isn't really being protected in this struggle.
Can I add something to that? Because it seems to me one way of considering that is that, it was interesting when you're talking about the family and that being one unit of analysis, right? Is this a distinction between providing rights to people who have a home, right? Who have privacy, who can use that space, and those who we might consider as homeless? Because a lot of the youth that I work with on the streets, they engage in sex work, for survival at times, and clearly, Sanjay, what you were talking about, I think refers in some ways to that nexus. So, I'm very sensitive to that, who's visible, who's invisible, right? And so I think the idea of home or the homeless or those without a home, or for whom home is a much more difficult issue, maybe a line to think about.
And the judges actually discussed this, and much more than I think the original petitioners were able to, in how the act of doing something in public that is intimate creates a space that can make the public into private, so that they blurred those boundaries, and they were great.
I'm just wondering, as a question, because you mentioned the question of hijra presence and absence in these debates. If there was an earlier regime of publicity, if hijras were always in film, were always central to how certain kinds of sexual difference were made public and so forth, and there's been a series of very diverse, regionally in many other ways, relations between a variety of Kinar Koti Hijra, variously transgendered communities, and the NGOs and the community organizations over the last 15 years, but I'm just wondering, where have hijras been at all in 377 debate? This is one question. The other question, 377, and not necessarily, I don't want to just the two of you, but anyone, is where have been the voices of efforts to not to read up the law again? So I'm thinking of Baba Ramdev, the yoga
Infinite faster.
yeah. Well, yes, and it's who most recently, of course, was when he tried to hold a major event in New Delhi on the Ramlila grounds, and the Congress government cracked down. I mean, he got away apparently in women's clothes, so it raised an interesting and unexpected, question. But but how to make sense of something like Ramdev? What is the, that's one question. And then where is the hijra in this?
Sure.
Yeah.
Good questions. I don't know. I mean, others can. Yeah. Because when the law was being formulated, as Anjali was pointing out, one of the things that we're also formulating is how to ban. They were formulating laws around adoption, for example. The hijras were not to adopt. The whole succession acts were being planned in around the 1870s, and the hijras. So hijras, even in this particular case, have been always a problematic issue, problematic category, because. Not because these are bad people who have filed this petition, but because the history of class in India, and that's precisely the problem. I think that judges recognize that to their credit, and these are two judges who've been very, in Indian terms, progressive, because one of their partners work in the NGO sector, they've had a lot of feedback and that kind of stuff, but. It's ironic because Naz's petition, Naz does work with all kinds of people, including hijras. So it's ironic that hijras kind of got left out in some ways, or they weren't addressed as directly. But there are other kinds of middle class politics to that as well.
I think one way to answer that question, and I'd like to hear what Philip has to say about this in terms of your grassroots works, is that, too bad Gayatri is not here. Gayatri Reddy, whose wonderful book With Respect to Sex is about precisely this question, is perhaps one way to think about the absence as being explained through the fact that hijras, despite their disenfranchisement in a certain way, have never been invisible from the production of Indian history or historiography, broadly speaking. They've always been present. They have sort of representatives elected, etc. One could do that version, but that's less interesting. So I think what's complicated about 377, it's speaking to an invisibility that is not admissible, even if you admit it to be wrong, right? The argument around 377, like the health minister, is that this simply isn't here. It's not part of who we are. Whereas nobody, even the right or the left, would argue that hijras are not part and parcel of our quote-unquote culture, right? What value we assign to them can be heavily debated, but no one is going to question their presence. As you see in any mega city or in any area of India, there's always a very vibrant constituency of hijras walking around in public spaces. And they are regulated against, for sure, but their presence can be felt. So that's one way I think that, and you see that in the earlier colonial model too. One of the reasons why hijras are slowly not legislated against in the sodomy statutes is because there are too many of them, right? And they're visibly present and they're endorsed by the colonial rulers as well as by their collaborators, i.e. the kings and the zamindars, etc., who give them money, etc. So that would be one, interesting way. But what would be interesting to hear from you, Philip, perhaps, would be in these drop-in centers that you run, etc., what is the distinction made between communities who identify as hijras versus community identifies trans, which are often read as the same? Yeah. But a lot of hijra communities, particularly, say, for example, in Maharashtra, do not identify as trans. Sure. For them, the identification with hijra carries a particular religious, historical, political weight that trans does not. And of course, the project is the same. So I was wondering what your experiences were.
Yeah, in the 7 districts that I was working, Anjali, the hijra population was kind of confined to certain pockets. Like in Guntur, we had a considerable number of hijra population. Again, in Vizag, we had considerable number of hijra population. But it was kind of missing in West Godavari and in other places. They were there, but it was not in considerable numbers. So at the DICs, the politics between the MSMs and the hijras, or the transsexuals and transvestites or other things, it was not much, I should say, honestly, because as an HIV intervention, goal or the person, that we were doing, our goal was to get all these members who were at high risk, and make them aware of what the services that the program was offering and how they can, take the services. So therefore, there was not much of tension though, but the identities, like I started off earlier, was, they were aware of certain terminologies, but, like transvestites, for example, would be a completely foreign thing, so, and especially in the areas that I was working, it was completely like rural or / tribal, because Srikakulam, Vijayanagaram, Vizag, East Godavari, 4 districts in the, Eastern Ghats, the tribal population there. So the awareness on these kind of nuances was little less.
I'd like to pick up on something that Sanjay raised earlier, which is that in a sense, we can talk about 377 and sort of what gets recognized, what doesn't get recognized, this sort of categorical, if you like, structure of the law itself. But Sanjay also pointed out that in a way, irrespective of what happens with 377 in the Indian Penal Code, there are all kinds of other forms of regulation that continue to operate, whether we're talking about just informal, practical, everyday forms of interaction or policing, or whether we're talking about, say, municipal enactments that could be in the name of public order or indecency or something else. So, I mean, in a sense, the question also is, what kind of significance does the status of something like 377 have vis-a-vis the larger public field of regulation?
I mean, that's a nice point, because there are many other laws which actually can be applied to homosexual.
Yeah.
It could be an obscenity or whatever.
Solicitation.
So it's quite interesting that, that this is, of course, a really significant judgment, but it's interesting to think about other contexts, that the number of laws you actually apply, as you could, I imagine, in other countries as well. Yeah.
And they could be even more aggressive, because as a backlash.
Yes.
In fact, when we were in the
That's
field
right, yeah.
after 377, we saw more arrests, we saw
Yes.
more harassment by
Yeah.
police,
Yeah.
and hopefully there's a couple of my students watching from Hyderabad, and they're seeing that now
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
William,
But with
the
the-
one place where this is really taking up is in the bar girls controversy in places like Mumbai, because of the line it skirts between obscenity, solicitation, and I think a lot of feminists have been asking, with the focus on 377, what is being lost in these other arenas, which are in fact impacting a large labor force, and so the focus on MSM also is one that we need to push against if it is not aligned with these other questions, because bar girls are that tenuous, purgatory category of neither here nor there. So, sorry, I interrupted, Philip.
No, I just curious to know from John that these arrests were under Article, Section 377?
No.
Okay, yeah.
No.
So,
Under the
Use
other.
all kinds of.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
John is right. In fact,
Yeah.
it may be done with greater aggression now.
right, yeah.
And that's a really
Yeah.
important point.
Yeah, because in our intervention also for the 4 years that I was working with the MSM community, we have seen many arrests,
Yeah.
okay, but never on 377.
Vagrancy, for example.
Yeah, or
Always used.
holding ganja or
That's right.
creating public nuisance,
Yeah.
those kind of things. But though the police knew that this person was kind of selling sex to a man, and he could be arrested on 377. But I think probably because their own knowledge was less, and and they didn't know how to deal with that. So.
Yeah.
So I think, I was just going to point out that along with that, I think that brings up the challenge for the researchers and also people who do, clinical or public health interventions in this space, that by virtue of doing that work, we are making these behaviors and these activities more visible, right? And I think there is a certain amount of risk involved in that, and I think, that's where we have to give consideration to, the lived experience of the people who are facing those everyday realities, and not that would necessarily stop the research, but I think it would add an element of caution, and at least be cognizant about the fact that we're making things more visible in that process.
I mean, the point that Lawrence says is interesting about the people who were protesting against this. What that has done, as Lawrence says, is actually brought about a kind of a religious harmony, because you have Christian groups, Hindu groups, and Muslim groups, and various other groups who've all gotten together and they've filed a petition together. So it's groups who are otherwise completely opposed to each other,
Anti-377.
and have formed this anti-377 platform. So saying this is what all our religions say to us.
In a certain sense, this also raises the question of networking, right? I mean, here we have
Yes,
an
exactly.
unexpected form of solidarity that
Fellows.
arises in the face of something that is appears to be oppressive from a number of different standpoints.
Yeah, yeah.
And so perhaps that would also be a way of linking back to one of the things Niranjan was saying, is that, you know, if you are dealing with populations that in one way or another are marginal or displaced or don't have a lot of recourse to the sort of, shall we say, middle-class forms of civic self-protection. Is there any scope in new forms of networking, for instance, for the kind of populations that you deal with? I mean, access to making connections through, say, the internet or other means of...
I think it's a great question. I mean, I think I often hesitate to say that, you know, something new is happening, because anytime somebody says that, they immediately, somebody else will find you know, something old that mirrors it. So, but I would say it's an interesting moment to think about it, because I think young people are using social media and social networks in ways that are different perhaps than previous generations, or that present new opportunities to do that. And I think it's connecting them. It's a way to access their world. It obviously has certain risk elements to it all in terms of them, but it also potentially has benefits in terms of creating these solidarities and new understandings that people are pointing to. So I think it's an interesting opportunity.
Do you know, there's this novel, and I apologize to the author because I don't remember the author's name. It's in English. It's by a young man who wrote it from Punjab, and he's writing about spending time in chat rooms. I believe in Chandigarh, but it's and encountering a kind of gay world through and setting up and coming in as a young man with a passion to be liberal and a passion focused on questions of rights and a whole set of things that become very important to his sense of what it is to grow up as an ethical person and enter the world and as he encounters a variety of other young men primarily, and then later some women who identify in very different ways sexually, he finds his passions tested. The question is, can he really have these friendships? And the fact that this novel emerges, you know, and it gets some circulation in English language readerships across India is interesting. So there are a series of novels, at least, that stage social networks as providing the site where a whole new set of ethical challenges organized around rights are being created.
Well, there is also a kind of emergent network of pornographic videos that are uploaded. So, for example, when we were talking about media representations and you know, whether it's Nikhil and I, my brother Nikhil, sorry, or Don't Know Why, whatever, those are more sort of publicly recognizable that have to go through censorship. You know, that's one of the reasons the film hasn't been released. But if you just, I mean, you can do this, we go home and Google Don't Know Why on YouTube, you'll find a terrible trailer, but on the side, the block, you'll find a bunch of videos that are homemade porn videos around by South Asian men. So there's that, you know, form, but it's a network. It's a network through this film, which you cannot see, which is being censored because it has one little coitus scene, but then you have on this right-hand side links to all sorts of places where you can, I mean, and it doesn't matter, you know, so then the relevance of whether those men are gay or not is, you know, it's like cruising the web here for gay pornography, where you get a teaser for 2 minutes so that you can buy the 9-minute video or whatever, right? So there is those forms as well. But of course, again, the absence of gender, differently gendered bodies is noticeable, right? These are gay men in a very conventional sense of the word. They aren't, you know, MTFs or FTMs or transly dressed, you know, however you code that, and definitely no women. So that's another way in which I think the access and availability of social networking websites makes media consumption less modulated and less regulated around the kinds of lines that we are used to seeing, right? And I think that's something that's going to be worthwhile watching.
I know this is something Sanjay has thoughts about, so I want to put it on the table, is that in some ways when we're talking about things like the internet and its capacity to mobilize new networks, new communities and so forth, one of the things that's typically missing from a more, shall we say, policy-oriented discourse is any serious consideration of pleasure.
Quite.
Right. So when you, Anjali, bring up the question of pornography, I mean, we can have all kinds of conversations about that, but it's clear that people use the internet in order to access pornography, and that the component of pleasure in how people come to inhabit a space like the internet through things like sexually explicit representations of various kinds is absolutely crucial to thinking about how people form networks. So.
Sure, and I think we have in some ways moved on from earlier discussions, much more earnest discussions about obscenity and its impact on human beings, to, as you're saying, William, discussions about pleasure, that at a certain level people are able to have enough, not agency, but are able to both use things for pleasure, and but also able to do other things. I think that's important. And I think I just, wanted to get back. I think the network thing is really interesting in this particular context, because apart from the internet, what is happening, for example, especially in India and South Asia, is that you have people from really different class backgrounds who are involved in this kind of work. And what NGO work has done is to bring into interaction and bring into sort of a networking activity people from really different class backgrounds. And so people who are, for example, the workshop that I've been to, there was someone from Pakistan who's a trans person, man to woman, and who's obviously from a very specific background. And she deals with the rest of us, and I'm explicitly, people who are from very different background. And the understanding is that there is an understanding amongst us about how we address these issues. So that I think in the world of the sexual, a networking thing is particularly important, because of a common understanding around this term sexual. And I think that's been really productive in South Asia, at least, that how through NGO activity, despite all our criticisms and different kinds of attitudes we may have towards it, that what it's done is made available across class series of networks because of a political understanding over the term sexual, which I think is shared across classes, irrespective of the fact that they may not have the same educational background as me or others around this table. I don't know, Philip, that sort of matches with you. I mean, you must meet people who are from dramatically different background from you.
Yeah.
And they talk to you on equal terms.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
I was going to say there's also an interesting, within some of the work and the drop-in centers, we do have, college gays, kind of coming in and out of these venues, not necessarily into the drop-in centers, because there's still this sense of that's lower class, that's not for me. But we are seeing a little, obviously cell phones have revolutionized the way people communicate. We haven't seen as much of, chatting, internet sort of engagement per se, although it's growing. And I think that'll be something very interesting to watch over the next years. Now, there's this thing, this kind of fits in the theme of, West, going to East, if you will, but, you brought up the thing about some of even the judges were borrowing some of the things from Western decisions. When are we is there gonna be kind of a reversal of sorts? Is there, gay white culture, is there any influence from places like India or China? Places where there's just so much activity, so much life, stimulus. Are we seeing any semblances of that? For example, this whole roundtable is based upon the idea that the University of Chicago is now going to New Delhi and is going to set up a physical structure there. So there is some interest in, that part of the world from the leadership. And are we going to be adopting other things? We're going to be sending our students there. More and more physicians from India come and train here, but they're all going back to India. So are we going to see some of these also with sex identity and?
Well, I think in terms of academic disciplines, I would say what we in the US call queer studies or sexuality studies, the biggest challenge and provocation has come from the turn to geopolitics, meaning how do other geopolitical formations challenge our ability to understand what a stable category is, what is sexuality, what is a sex act. So I think within strictly academic disciplines, and this is where the division would make sense. Normally it wouldn't as much. You do see that has galvanized the field, but it has also created a different challenge, which is that the celebration of geopolitics has also led to a fetishization of the geopolitical, meaning anything, and the berdash, the transgender figure, has become the repository of that fetishization more than anything else. So some of the challenges that people who work in sexuality studies are seeing is how do you study what is not you, the other, understanding its complexity but not reifying it, not using it as a place to, which would be a colonial model, right? You move from savage to salvage.
Sure,
right?
sure.
So how do you avoid that kind of ethnocartography, so to speak? So I think you see that very much. It's at the center of the debates in sexuality studies right now, whether you call it transnational, etc. And I think it's become the heart of darkness, to use an old colonial metaphor in some ways. So, but Stuart, you might be able to address the more.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question to me. I mean, one of the things is that how do you think about this and study it in terms of you need to make these distinctions, but at the same time, they're so interpenetrated. So, I mean, I like when I'm thinking about this case, I mean, first of all, who's which and who? I mean, is a person who grows up here in the West with Indian ancestry operating, those sorts of identity.
Interesting.
I don't know what to call them, but basically there's an algebra or game of using and at any given moment those identities come forward and back. I mean, you mentioned, and I think I was already aware that organizations that grew up here, Tricone especially, have been influential. And then I guess what I was thinking about as we were having this discussion along those lines is really to bring back the question a little bit about the issues of generation and fluidity. The experience of the internet seems to me quite global in a certain way, and because when one thinks usually about the construction of gay identity, you're thinking about some process of discovery, and the way historians in the West have talked about it a lot. I mean, the importance of policing to making people aware. I mean, there's a very famous in sort of the modern history of gay movements and identity in the U.S. is talking about like a Life magazine article about San Francisco's gay hell or paradise, but it was presented, of course, as a very negative, but of course it also brought to people's attention that there was this incredible flowering of a public commercial culture that, we're in a different world today. I mean, and this also relates back to the question of regional variation, but also the metropolitan versus the urban versus the rural and the metropolitan, so that it's got to be quite different the way that having these connections and knowledge through the internet. I guess I have a sort of a crazy hypothesis that some of the fluidities about identities are emphasized and amplified by that, because one can be there in the chat room, one can be having these interactions, but there's somehow seemingly less investment to having to go to a place and live there or be in the confines of that physical environment and then either choose to leave or stay or whatever, versus the kind of visiting that can go.
So I'm wondering, we've been talking a lot about fluid subjects, and at least three kinds of fluid subjects have been offered or in different ways, and I mean, I'm coming with a kind of instinctive caution about the presumptions of fluidity as liberatory, as opening, as producing the kinds of real cross-class commensuration or possibility. And I think Sanjay's absolutely right that in many ways the NGO is one of several sites where at certain moments and not others,
Of course.
certain forms of
Yeah.
both
Yeah.
collaboration and also confrontation can happen in ways that couldn't happen otherwise, as well as many moments in which, as Philip was alluding to, and someone said, well, he's a gay, he won't fit within the network, in which it becomes a site where, over time, that differentiation happens, and you get multiple networks. But it's and it's not either or. But the three fluidities. So the first is, Naranjan had earlier, I think, alluded to people, younger people using the internet and refusing an identity, saying I'm a fluid subject, I don't want to play this, the gay, straight, etc., and don't give me your categories. Second, John started us out with the question of is the double-decker or doparata, etc., becoming a certain kind of a new, more fluid versatility. And the third, when Anjali raised the question of bisexuality, and here I'm thinking very specifically, so I'm thinking part how bisexuality enters into a series of Marathi newspapers, but I'm thinking specifically of the internet. And a student of mine worked on Craigslist, and it's so there's a lot of for example, straight identified men who are on the on the casual encounters and men looking for men sections of Craigslist in many certainly cities and towns across this country, the U.S. It's to the point where some have argued that, in fact, a goodly plurality of the men on Craigslist, in fact, and one could make a crazy hypothesis here that because of the commensurating possibilities of pornography, that a larger variety of men may be encountering the pleasurable possibilities of gay porn, not exclusively or primarily, but as part of a portmanteau of pleasures, and may or may not find themselves in an identitarian crisis, or may in fact produce a new kind of identity which is fluid, but in fact may produce a new form of heterosexuality, and within a world in which the homosexual binary has not disappeared, in which you have a new kind of fluid heterosexuality in some senses, which the effects of which on for various forms of queer people may not be so happy. And this goes back to the questioner who said, I was very unhappy about Dostana. Because you could argue that what Dostana does, you could say Dostana, this film, is about straight men pretending to be gay in a fantasy world where the U.S. immigration apparatus loves homosexuality. But but in fact, you could argue that it's a new kind of male heterosexuality, which stages its relationship or figures it to homosexuality. Yeah. Not simply through homosexual panic, but a different kind of homosexual panic.
Yeah, sure.
And
No,
that's,
I agree.
that's interesting. Yeah.
And
That's jargon. Sorry.
The idea, for example, what can the University of Chicago Center, what can it bring back, as it were? One of the biggest problems, I think, historically has been, for example, in NGO work, looking for something called Indian sexuality. So whenever people would do something, I remember reading stuff, people would say, but these people don't know their own history of sexuality because they haven't, And one of the biggest problems has been, in fact, that there's been a gloss that NGOs have had to establish or do, saying, well, what is culturally specific about Indian sexuality? And there may not have been anything culturally specific. So it's always kind of a risk. It's always that risk, and where do you stand on that? Because I've come across some of the most bizarrely anthropological work. So anthropologists have been asked to say, well, tell us if you want to actually act good anti-AIDS policy, we really need to know what is Indian about this sexual behavior, right? And it seems to me to be more significant to say that there may not be any authentic Indian sexuality, but simultaneously we keep in mind the historical context through which so-called Indian sexuality is passed through, and that some of that has to do with, for God's sake, 300 years of interaction with the West. I mean, and so what do you actually? Even the Kama Sutra has been produced through through an interaction with the West, and the Indians are saying, yes, this is our genuine sexuality, and Michel Foucault saying, yes, of course, this is how Eastern sexuality differs from Western sexuality. They have the arts erotica. So I think that we really need to take seriously there may not be something called authentic Indian sexuality that we bring back, but nevertheless, what is historically specific, so that at any point in time, what is Indian is different from what is Western, but not in any essential sense, because of reasons of economy and culture and class, so which keeps changing.
One of the questions that come in from the great internet, since we're speaking of the internet while we've been talking, which I thought actually was quite interesting, and I'm sure some of you will know something about this. Of course, there have been a lot of controversies about the teaching of history in Indian schools and Indian textbooks and so forth, but the question was really about sex education in Indian schools and what's happening with that, and whether within sex education in Indian schools there is any kind of attempt to deal with questions of homosexuality, same-sex relationships, and if so, how? Anyone?
Again, from the HIV point of view, what we have done is in the school, starting from class 8th or 9th, in different states, we've started these RRCs, Red Ribbon Clubs, what we call.
Sorry, could you say that again?
Red Ribbon Clubs.
Red ribbon
Yeah,
clubs.
so, yeah, so the red ribbon is the AIDS ribbon, and as part of that curriculum, this is like once in a week class, for a stipulated hour, and the students are given subject on sex and sexuality, and in Tamil Nadu, which I've seen as a very progressive state, the RRCs have gone to the extent of actually inviting the sex worker and also MSM and giving them a small talk to the students and then taking questions from them.
And these are students of what age?
Like class 8 is like about 13.
Okay.
Yeah, 13, 14.
And what kind of a historical background are we talking about here in terms of sex education in Indian schools? I mean, what existed before this? What has been the mode?
Well, to go back to the India Today explosive expose about how many teens were having sex, and this was, I think, last year, maybe, or a year and a half ago. So I think that's already galvanized a lot of anxiety around the fact that something needs to be done, which has then not been about homosexuality, in fact, but had been about how many young boys and girls are having sex at an alarmingly early age, and then more. So I think it's better in some ways if we enfold it into a larger spectrum of sexuality rather than, and I'm not sure because I don't do that work and actually don't know very much about it, but I know that scandal was all over everywhere because they interviewed kids between 14 and 16 and 80% of them had sex, which is quite remarkable. Of course, these were urban places, one must note that, and they were largely middle-class kids, which is also an important detail. So.
Yeah, I think it varies. I know the privates, it's very ad hoc. I remember private schools have been sometimes we invite another friend called Rahul Roy who makes films on masculinities and me, and Rahul usually goes, he's much better at it. But a lot of the private schools are doing it, but on a very ad hoc basis. But I can't say from this conversation with my daughters about what their friends say about non-heterosexual behavior. There's been a great success in terms of a more liberal attitude towards. And the government schools, there's almost none. There's something called life science, but it doesn't really address sexuality. There was a much greater movement in the 1960s, in fact. I remember reading Dharm Yug, this old Hindi magazine, where people were saying, yes, we must have sex education in schools. And I think that was linked to, to a notion of population. And once that concern with population has fallen away to a much more consumption kind of thing, that concern with that government schools must also have has fallen away. I remember certainly in the 60s, there were lots of articles in Hindi magazines saying sex education is important, and school principals writing in saying this is what we do, this is how we do it, but specifically to do with family planning. And the population was the category under which it was done. But right now it's very ad hoc. Private schools will do it, as Anjali was pointing out, suggesting. And they will call people, not that there are trained sex educators, but they'll call people who are sort of just randomly selected because you work on this. And those are not necessarily people who are good at it. You have to need people who are good at it. So it's very ad hoc right now.
Because, and this may not be just an issue for India, but first of all, there's a number of questions coming in right now from Hyderabad, and there's a kind of an MSM group that's watching this. So it'd be nice to engage them a little bit. Some of their questions, one of them which I find really interesting, and is I think an issue here as well, is this issue of that gay and it's unable to be disentangled from sex and sexuality, such that someone asks after the age of 30 or 40, what is next for gay men in India? Is what what does their life look like? What do they do? A lot of our conversation has been about young people.
On the assumption that they won't have sex after 30 or 40?
I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
But,
That's not true.
but we could say the elder, the aging,
Uh-huh.
the aging. I mean, we're talking about
Sure.
a population so far that are, 30 youth, adolescents. But say the aging gay Indian man, what's in store for him?
Yeah, don't look at me.
I mean, I think the questioner is responding to a question that historically has emerged in India at various points, in the U.S. and many places at various points, which is it is hard to be homosexual because you will have a lonely old age. And that takes on very specific resonance in India, among other places, because of the importance of how thinking about the family as a form of social security has been central to modern social relations and the state. And it's so, I mean, one thing one could say is that there are many experiments. I'm thinking of groups in Bombay and elsewhere in Maharashtra and Delhi, of people talking about how do we care for each other over the life course, both informally through friendship networks, but also formally. I mean, and raising from a somewhat famous Rajput prince who's out to many other figures, there's been lots of conversations about what kinds of communities might we create. Now, again, those tend to target middle class and even more elite men, and but certainly there's the gay group has been one site, but in many parts of the world, and certainly in San Francisco where I live, in many parts of the city, various kinds of queer communities, people often disappear from those communities. It's not that they disappear. In some cases, for example, transgendered communities, or particularly in certain parts of the city, there's immense violence and there is disappearance by death or disease. But there's also there are questions that people disappear from the research apparatus.
I think that there's one other thing, which I think, Lawrence, I'm not sure if you've written about, but I know that you and I have talked about it many years ago, which is that, and this has escalated now in the last 5 or 6 years, particularly in Mumbai, is the murder of older gay men, right? And of course, there's the famous case of the professor, which is not a Maharashtra-based case, but so there's been, and remarkably, escalation, which is, 5 murders a year is a lot, if they are, and who knows how many more, but these are the ones that are publicized, of older gay men who are generally affluent, who have been murdered in their apartments, either by servants or lovers, alleged lovers, or who are usually working class. So there is that, which is already, as someone who has elderly parents who live in India, the Jyeshta Nagarik Sangh are always very concerned about the rise of elderly crime. This is a middle class concern across the board. But then you latch on to the idea of, so I think there is a physical, representation of it to be found, and of course with the horrible case of the professor that was, a lot of us organized around, who was viciously kind of mistreated by the institution. That makes it even a broader, problem.
I think one of the interesting things here is that I've thought that, that, for example, homophobia in India is not only related to homosexuality. I think it's also a relationship between sexuality and asexuality.
Quite.
That elderly people, especially, the notion that elderly could be, whatever, over 40 or whatever, that sexuality and aging, which Lawrence has worked upon, should be de-linked. So I think a great deal of homophobia right now, of men who are older men, is also to do with a historical understanding of the relation between sexuality and asexuality. I think that's significant in the Indian context. So if I was to be asked, what do you think is Indian about Indian sexuality, I would say one of the things is not just the relationship between heterosexuality and homosexuality, but sexuality and asexuality. And I think these men are doubly damned, the older men, because not only are they homosexuals, but they're older men. And that they should be, at this stage, they should be moving towards less and less sex rather than continuing to be part. So that becomes kind of enmeshed, the two contexts. That's one sense you get when you talk to people about it.
That theme, by the
He's
way.
an aging man. He'll tell you.
Worried about, but it's one theme that I read about a long time ago about a group of friends in Calcutta who were young men in Jadavpur at a university in Calcutta, who said that look, but it was about the theme of asexuality and sexuality, which is we don't get gay guys because, you know, this isn't America. We don't get access to girls, but you don't see us going and having sex with guys. And there's a way in which there's a certain kind of structuring of the self and a certain ability to not have sex, which is central to what it is to be a strong and ethical person. And so the homosexual becomes seen as that person who can't wait. We all could go and have sex with guys. I mean, we wouldn't mind it. I mean, what else are we going to, you know? But it's so there's that kind of discourse.
Another question that came up was that someone said discrimination begins at home, and sexual problems begin at home, and then they turn into non-sexual problems. How is India going to focus on non-sexual needs of gay men? So I would think of what mental health might be one of those non-sexual needs.
I think this is an interesting question, partly also coming back to some of the things we were talking about before, having to do with in a sense, the economy of attention in a mass public, right? Is that the sex of it becomes both the sort of the condition of attention, the reason why people pay attention, but also the kind of unassimilable object, right? So it becomes the source of revulsion and antipathy as well. So those two things are playing out in a highly sort of emotional way, where thus sort of bracketing in a way some of these other kinds of concerns that are not directly about the sexual act itself, such as it may be. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting question.
I mean, you know, there's debates whether the HIV movement, the attention to AIDS, the infrastructure, whether that has any other spillover effect onto other, you know, chronic conditions, whether they be diabetes or mental health, and it's an open debate. I mean, it's very specialized services, but they've been able to, you know, create this mass community mobilization of, you know, young gay men and who would, you know, may have other things treated perhaps or examined. Is there any sense of that? Do you see, you know, Bill and Melinda Gates, NACO, all these groups, these drop-in centers, are there any other benefits beyond, you know, quote, sexual health, the non-sexual needs?
Yeah. In the NACO program, I should honestly say that, you know, there have been a lot of efforts to mainstream both the female sex workers and the MSMs. So I think those efforts are happening, and this advocacy is yet another thing, you know, which is like very, very strong, you know.
Can you say more about this mainstreaming?
Yeah. So therefore, what is happening is, like, say for example, in Guntur district where we were working, there were this bunch of hijras, you know, TGs, who never existed in the government's eyes, you know. So when the interventions of whether Gates Foundation or SACS and NACO, when they have started, what we have done is we went to the government, we got their ration cards, you know, this is to get the public distribution system so that, you know, they get cheaper rice and other essentials. Then we got the land pattas, you know, so those kind of things, and access to government hospitals, because earlier, you know, it was a big issue for them, and therefore the double stigma of, you know, being an MSM or a TG and then being a positive, you know, you're just not allowed in and you're not treated well in the government hospitals. So those kind of efforts have yielded results, and therefore, you know, probably they are, you know, coming in such large numbers as part of the mobilization drives.
I mean, I think the other place which Lawrence will be able to speak about is, you know, Ashok Kavi's work on religious identities, which is part of the non-sexual. I mean, this hasn't really taken off in India as much in terms of the visible discourse around it. Whereas in the US, of course, you have, you know, entire communities of gay Christians, gay whatever. But I think in South Asia in particular, because of the immediate impulse to think about religious forms and faiths as inherently repressive, right? The instinctual concern that one has around those. But I think the work that Ashok, which has been very controversial, but interesting nevertheless, is to where are the, to use a much cliched word, spiritual needs of the community, you know, not just psychic, which in some ways would be the same, but there is that question too, because there are a lot of, and I know that in the Catholic community there has been some discussion around that question, but Ashok Kavi was one of the first people to speak of that, and obviously opened the floodgates to a lot of criticism by doing so.
But
Yeah.
I want to say, I think that some of this goes to, I think, what can be made visible in terms of this. I mean, I think part of the reason why HIV/AIDS gets so much attention, right, has been the very successful activist movement to separate it from sort of moral questions and say, look, this is about a virus. This is about a virus that, you know, causes a disease that kills people, right? And I think that transformation in the Western discourse has been very successful and carries over, and resources flow along that line. And I think the issues around sort of spirituality, but also around psychology and mental health, are much more difficult because they are, you know, they continue to be intrinsically linked to moral questions. Like you're depressed and suffering because you aren't trying hard enough, right? I mean, you know, or the notion that you know was recently stated in Congress by, you know, a House member that, oh, children can't get depressed. You know, I mean, there's just this blanket notion that, you know, these things don't exist because there's no test for it, right? You can't visualize it on a test and say, oh yes, here's the blood test that indicates this, or here's the, you know, I mean, now there are attempts to develop brain scans that indicate that, but they, you know, it still doesn't, you know, result in that. And I think that difference is there. So it's almost like we lump all of this other stuff into that moral universe, right? Where it's up to the individual or the immediate family, and other things are allowed to be given resources. And I think in India, that's a very real issue as much as it is here in the U.S., that we don't fund the mental health systems. You know, it's not a priority. You know, in India, if you have money and you have means, you can get probably, you know, good mental health care. But, you know, and that's the same thing here in the U.S. You know, we're dealing with the thinnest of coverage here. So. Sorry, I seem to have ended the conversation with that.
But there have been
Exciting
places,
note.
I think NIMHANS, for example, I've met people from there who've certainly been in Bangalore, who've certainly been, who've been at workshops to do with sexuality and have been discussing the topic in the way that we've been discussing it. But as Niranjan said, of course, the most significant thing is that is one of money, even if there was another political will. But there are small-scale efforts, nothing structural or systematic. But I know that people at NIMHANS have been working on this and looking at. I mean, the only kind of danger is to, you know, and I think they recognize it, is to automatically link homosexual identity and mental health as two kind of link things. You know, that you need special kind of mental health treatment. That's one of the things. I think people are aware of that, yeah, in as much as it's happening.
There's a group of men I'm thinking of in Benares who at a time when we think about complicated care for men who have sex with men, and the rise of sexology, and something that you've written about at great length. It's and there's a lot of films recently which make fun of or critique, you know, for understandable reasons, the prescriptions by a variety of healers who are framed as quacks to get rid of homosexuality. But at least in the early mid-1990s in Benares, there were a fair amount of people, gurus and Maulvis who people I knew went to, not for their homosexuality, but for all the kinds of family problems one would want to go to. And because a number of these men were tantrics, they were men, the healers, or if Maulvis still brought in a lot of non-orthodox practice into their treatments. Conversations about sexual practice became very much part of those very important relationships. And so my sense is there are a whole range of relationships which have been important for for example, mental health, which are not about curing homosexuality or treating the mental health problems that come with homosexuality, but rather come with treating people who have sex with other people of the same sex, and that enters into who they are and how they are responded to by a guru. And not to valorize that too easily, but there are a whole host of healing relationships that have been worked through for quite a
Can I
while.
add one line?
Sure.
I think the rise of sexology is really significant. Even now, it's to be, and it stretches across all kinds of sexual identities and behaviors. And right, I think in India there's a sense, as there has been in the West, that if you're bad at cooking, it's passable. To be bad at sex is an existential crisis, right? If you're a bad cricketer or football player, it's okay. And that kind of feeds into the broad sense about why it's so important to go to sexologists and get yourself treated in whatever way.
Right.
Because to be bad at sex is an existential crisis. It's terrible.
All right. On that note, thank you. I'd like to thank the audience first and foremost for stimulating this discussion, especially in the second half, and also living through perhaps poor web feeds and bad internet connections. I also want to thank the camera crew and the technical crew for helping us out today and in the weeks and months before this. I'd like to extend special thanks to all of the panelists members for joining us today, and also people like Rachel who really kind of organized and galvanized this event. A lot of the students in India and in other places for also creating publicity. And I don't know if you've noticed the UFC emblem or logo has been changed permanently to say sexual health and identity in India with a nice design by a student from UPenn. So again, thanks to everyone, and I hope this will be one of many conversations on this issue and others. Thanks.
Thank you, John.
Thank you very much.